Shall I go ahead?
Tell them all, John. We're here to hear them all.
Oh, well, we had come back from one of the flights, and I know a fellow named Richard Wood was the right race gunner, and I cleaned out that ship entirely. But I got awakened, and Cool, my pilot, said that the Major Tower wants to see you. He was the commander of Drew Field. And I said, well, what's he want with me? He says, well, I understand that a 50 caliber bullet was put into one of your guns and fired. And it was an armor piercing type bullet, and it hit the hangar at the top. Went outside through 3 wax barracks on the upper floor. Went through the escape doors and lodged into a telephone pole on the other end of there. Had any one of those wax had gotten out into the center of that, they would have gone right through them. Probably killed them. But anyway, that's what stops. Major Tower says, Roberts, he says, he told me what happened. That's how I really found out everything that happened. And at that time, I was a staff sergeant, but I walked out there as a buck private. So anyway, a few weeks later, why, Lieutenant Cool did get me corporal stripes back. So anyway, I couldn't come home for Christmas. So I went to see my aunt, which was a nurse at St. Barnes Hospital in St. Louis. We traveled to Kabul, Missouri, to where my family was. I was born, by the way, in Springfield, Missouri. And we went visiting and so forth. So I knew it was time for me to go home. So when I started out, I went to the train station first, and they had a storm that had just closed absolutely everything down. It just did not move, nothing. I went to the cab driver and I said, I'll pay you the money if you'll take me back to Tampa, Florida. Can't do it. He says, they can't get out of town. I said, well, what am I going to do? He says, I don't know. So I called Major Tower, told him what had happened. He said, well, when you can, you get back. So when I got back, he called me in right away. And I was a corporal, remember? And I was a buck private when I walked out of it. So anyway, I went overseas as a buck private and in charge of 6 enlisted men. And there were, of course, 10 of us all together who marched. We made our way to, actually it's called Horn Field in South Carolina. Picked up a brand new B-17G, beautiful airplane. Wasn't even painted yet, but it did have the markings and everything on it. We flew to Homestead, Florida, Homestead down to Puerto Rico, and on into Trinidad and Bloom. And when we got to Bloom, we found out that my pilot, Lee Cool, had TB. They gave him medication, and he refused to go to the hospital because he had the croup. He flew in all the missions and when we were overseas with TB. So anyway, that shows the dedication of our men. We get to Dakar, on into, well, while we were in Brazil, we went to Fortaleza and then to Dakar, 12 hours and 4 minutes. On the way, a storm hit going across the Atlantic Ocean, and we had put in a half of the bomb bay, a fuel tank, and the other half was B-17 parts. I get out there and I realize that there were fumes coming out into the bomb bay, but didn't really think too much about it at the time. I could smell it. I opened up the door to the radio room, and the radio operator had let out the antenna, and there were sparks flying up that antenna from this storm that we had and hitting the side of and I could see them. And I closed that door to the bomb bay real quick, yelled at him to reel in that antenna. Otherwise, it could have, if I'd opened that door up and left it, the fumes would have ignited and we would have been down over the Atlantic Ocean. But within 12 hours and 4 minutes later, we landed in the car. After we refueled in the car, getting ready to go to Marrakech, Morocco, the first plane, we were the third one to take off. The first one took off down the runway and pulled up like we always did, you know, to get the altitude. And it exploded. Couldn't figure out what that was all about. The ground crew and the MPs went out there and looked and searched that place over. And they reported back that there was nothing out there. So the second bomber took off. And as he rose, he did the same thing as the first one did, and he exploded. We lost 2 good ships and 20 men on that trip. Lieutenant Cool had enough sense to cut his engines down and called the tower and says, "I'm not moving out of here until you find out what's going on." I sat between the pilot and the co-pilot and watched the instruments and what have you, and I looked out over the wing, and I could see where the fumes were coming out of the vent on top of the wing, and I looked at the other one on the other side, and it's doing the same thing. And I called the attention to the pilot and the co-pilot. I said, "I think maybe that when they took off and pulled up so fast that the fumes and the fuel itself had rolled off and went through the turbine, and when it hit the turbine, which is part of the exhaust system, that's what exploded those airplanes." So he called the tower. And he says, "I'm going to start my engines." He says, "I think I know what the problem is." We started down the runway. He raised the tail real high, and it took us about 10 miles to gain 100 feet or 200 feet, something like that. And then he radioed back. He says, "All the planes that are behind me, if they do the same thing that I did, that they'll be able to make it." We had overfilled the night before because it was so cool that and then as soon as the temperature came up, that's what made the fuel come out of the vents, and we realized that that's what it was. So we did make it to Marrakech, and when we got to the mountain area, the Atlas Mountains, why Cool says, "We're not going to be able to get through this valley." He says, "We're going to have to climb higher." So I was in agreement to that. So we went to a high altitude, but not knowing it was freezing up there. Fortunately, this brand new plane we had de-icers on it, and the ice would form on the front of the wings, and the de-icers would help dissolve or break it off. The sad part about it was when we started to land at Marrakech, the gear would not come down. We had frozen the motors and the I'm trying to think, the transmission portion of the oil and what have you had frozen to when we tried to put the gear down, it sheared off the, what we call the key on the shafts of both wheels. And so this Richard Wood and I spent some long minutes lowering the gear on each side and made a landing with 40 gallons of fuel left when we finally landed. 2 or 3 of the other planes that were behind us were not that fortunate. Their gear froze, but they had to make belly landings. But we did make it into Marrakech. Took us a little while to find out what the deal was. The mechanics were involved in this, and I said, I want to see those keys. As I looked at them, and I took a file, and they were not case hardened. And so we immediately called all the other, the planes and what have you, to have them checked. And it was quite a series of keys that were soft. And so we had to replace them all before we left Marrakech. We did get into Tunisia with a very little problem, and on up to, I was in from Tunisia we went to Foggia. From that time on, it was just day in and day out of flying from Amadella Field. We took 3 flights in that plane that I'll tell you about and took a day off. And when we took a day off, another crew that was near us took that brand new B-17G and got shot down. Sergeant Gowan had the same position that I had, and found out later, as a big long story, about how he bailed out with 100 and some holes in him. And a farmer, when he picked him up, took him in the underground and got him back to Foggia after a certain length of time. We had a B-17 that what I called stripped down, that would fly about 50 feet off of the ocean, a Radix Sea, to a little landing strip, pick up the boys and bring them back. And Sergeant Gowan was aboard on that deal. There's a story about that too, about how a Stuka bomber bombed him, and that is, was strafed him. But he did make it back. So anyway.
Sean, I'm going to interrupt you real quick and ask you if you would do us a favor. So that the young people understand, would you explain what your position was on that plane and what the different positions were of all 10 of those men?
Oh, okay.
I'll hold this model up so that they can see this is what John was flying on. And you can tell us a little bit about that if you would.
Turn it around so they can see.
Okay. See the men inside?
Yeah. The bombardier sits right there in the front. He took control of these 2 50 caliber machine guns, and the navigator sat right behind him. And in some of the models, this model did not have it on there. They have another single 50 caliber on each side, and he handled that one. The pilot and the co-pilot sat here, and they flew the plane and took care of it. And I sat between them and watched the instruments and everything. And if an instrument was a little off, a little odd, I'd tell the pilot to go and we'd try to correct it. So they handled that end of it. I was right here. This was what they call the upper turret, and that's my position. And when we went into combat and the fighters started hitting, that's where I'd jump out of the seat between the pilot and the co-pilot and jump into that upper turret and fire those 250 caliber machines very close to me. And that's one reason why I can't hear too good. We burned up an awful lot of ammunition shooting at the German fighters. Back in this area, right here, was where the radio operator said. He's on the south side of the bomb bay. And when we were over the target, the bomb bay doors were open, and I could look down through there and see what was going on. I could usually tell what was taking place when they dropped the bombs. And then, that's after the fighters left, and then that's when the flak started. And I got a piece of flak here that you can look at later. But anyway, the two-waist gunners took care of the areas on each side of the plane. The tail gunners all by himself, clear in the rear. And I was always concerned about him because the German fighters would come into that section, and many of the boys got injured because there was no other defense except for him in the rear. Because I couldn't shoot that far back. I could shoot up and around and so forth, and took care of all the upper ones. The bombardier would take care of the front, and the ball turret gunner would take care of things below. And in that way, we had a lot of protection, really, basically. But the German fighters were so persistent. They really were persistent. And they would come in. So when we were going to the target, we would spread it. We would close in to get as close as we possibly could together. And when we got to the target, we would spread out because there was an awful lot of flak involved. And it was easier for us to get missed if we were spread out. And then the fighters would hit us again as we come off the target, and we'd get closer together again. And in that way, we'd protect ourselves. But it was, one of the things. So what else shall I say now?
Why don't you tell us about that mission when you were in Italy, when 12 planes went out that day, 12 B-17s went out on that mission.
We left Amadella Field going to Venice, and it was oil fields, and there was a Messerschmitt manufacturing plant there, and other areas that we could have bombed. But this particular one, we were wanting the oil fields and the Messerschmitt factory. We went over that target, or started over that target, and they had what they call smoke bomb, or they had smoke on the ground. We could not see the target. So Lieutenant Kublai said he always talked with us to see what we were going to do and what we wanted to do. And he says, I want to go around. And so we all said, well, we want to go around too, because we can't see that target. Maybe it'll clear by the time we get around. But in the meantime, it was the plane on the right. He got a direct hit into the cockpit, and he exploded. It hit the cockpit and the bomb bay, and exploded. And as we made that round, the trip, turn around, we went right through that plane, that with the residue and the smoke and everything. And I didn't realize what it was at that particular time. And so I looked back, and I had what we call a K-20 camera that they'd issued to me to take pictures. So I took 2 pictures of it, where we'd gone through this thing and got into formation again to bomb. And when we did bomb the second time, why, we hit the target, took off and got back okay. But that's just an example of what we had to do. On another one, we had gone in. It was a high altitude, and we dropped down, and remember now there was 12 of us together. But when we left that target, there were only 2 of us, and there was one that was losing altitude and dropping behind because he had 2 engines out. We fortunately still had 4 engines. And when we finally realized that he was losing altitude and so forth, and we'd better drop down and get as close as we could because the German were out looking for, stragglers. So we got together and we stayed really close together. I went through the valleys of the Alps. And by the time we got to Italy, we weren't very high. And fortunately, we made a landing. We did great. And then he came in, and of course, he was all banged up and everything. Our ship was all shot to pieces too. And so we did make it back. Had we not been together, one of the German fighters could have spotted him and shot him down, which had happened many, many times.